My $800 billion project will light up Africa and build a world of pride and power, showing Africa can lead with its own strength.
In the heart of West Africa lies Burkina Faso, a small landlocked country long known for its struggles with poverty, limited infrastructure, and a lack of access to basic services. For decades, many of its citizens lived in rural villages without electricity. When the sun went down, homes fell dark, schools couldn't operate, and hospitals couldn't run vital equipment. But that reality is starting to change. Burkina Faso is now the center of one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in the world, an $800 billion hydroelectric and smart grid initiative designed not only to transform the nation, but to power much of West Africa. Led by 34-year-old Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the project aims to prove that African countries can lead major innovations without relying on traditional Western aid. At the core of the plan are 11 massive dams to be built along the Mohoun River. These dams will supply clean, renewable electricity to a smart power grid, capable of serving 15 neighboring countries, including Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Nigeria. The entire system will be managed by artificial intelligence to optimize efficiency and reliability. The scale of the project is unprecedented. With a price tag of $800 billion, it ranks among the largest infrastructure efforts ever undertaken, not just in Africa, but globally. And while many outside observers have questioned how a nation with Burkina Faso's modest GDP could take on such a task, Traoré and his team remain confident. Rather than seek financing from institutions like the IMF or World Bank, Traoré has turned to emerging economies such as Cuba, Iran, and Brazil. These partnerships have brought in engineers, architects, and technical expertise, while avoiding the conditions often attached to Western aid packages. Supporters say this model allows Burkina Faso to maintain control over its resources and priorities. Critics, however, warn that the high cost and complexity of the project could strain the country's limited administrative and financial capacity. Still, construction is already underway. Concrete is being poured, turbines are being installed, and miles of cable are being laid. Early signs are promising, with thousands of jobs created and local workers receiving training in construction, electrical engineering, and system operations. To Captain Traoré, this isn't just about electricity, it's about changing the narrative. For too long, African nations have been seen as dependent on outsiders for development. His goal is to show that, with the right vision and determination, countries like Burkina Faso can shape their own futures. If successful, the project could become a model for other nations across the continent. For now, all eyes are on this small West African nation and the bold young leader who's betting everything on a dream that many once called impossible. Before the $800 billion energy project began, daily life in Burkina Faso was defined by limitation. The country's infrastructure, particularly in rural areas, was underdeveloped. Electricity was available to only a small portion of the population, mostly in cities like Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso, while vast regions remained completely off-grid. In many villages, when night fell, people turned to kerosene lamps, candles, or open fires for light. These options were not only costly and inefficient, but also dangerous. The smoke harmed respiratory health, and fire accidents were not uncommon. Families couldn't refrigerate food or medicine. Students had to stop studying after sunset. Teachers struggled to use modern tools. Hospitals operated without basic life-saving equipment. In some cases, doctors performed emergency surgeries by flashlight or candlelight. Even in cities, electricity wasn't reliable. Blackouts were frequent, lasting hours or even days. Businesses often had to rely on diesel generators, which were expensive to maintain and added to pollution. Small enterprises unable to afford backup systems faced losses during outages. Internet connectivity was unstable. Productivity suffered. The consequences reached beyond inconvenience. Without power access to modern education, healthcare, and clean water remained limited. Vaccine storage was compromised. Medical clinics couldn't run ventilators or imaging equipment. Children had little exposure to digital tools, putting them at a disadvantage in an increasingly connected world. In agriculture, which employs more than 80% of the population, the lack of electricity meant most irrigation was manual or weather-dependent. During dry seasons, crop failure was common. Farmers couldn't run pumps or preserve produce. As a result, income remained low, and food insecurity persisted in many regions. Compounding these challenges was a history of political instability. Since gaining independence from France in 1960, Burkina Faso has experienced multiple coups and frequent government turnover. These disruptions weakened state institutions and discouraged long-term investment in national infrastructure. Foreign aid played a major role in keeping the country afloat, but it often came with strings attached. In many cases, aid agreements required the country to purchase fuel equipment or consulting services from donor nations. While helpful in the short term, such conditions often reinforced dependency and limited Burkina Faso's ability to set its own development priorities. Over time, this created a cycle in which the country could not fully control its path forward. By 2022, frustration was widespread. Access to electricity had stagnated. Over 60% of the population remained in energy poverty, living without reliable or affordable power. In rural areas, that number was closer to 90%. Public infrastructure was stretched thin, and optimism about progress was fading. It was against this backdrop that Captain Ibrahim Traoré came to power. For many, his rise signaled a break from the past and the possibility of a different approach. He believed that energy access was not just a technical issue, it was a foundation for national transformation. His plan would challenge decades of dependency and attempt to solve at scale a problem that had held the country back for generations. If this story resonates with your hopes for the continent, consider sharing it. A single spark of understanding can ignite a chain of possibility across borders, across generations. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré came to power in 2022, following a military coup, Burkina Faso was in the midst of political and economic uncertainty. His leadership was met with both hope and skepticism. Young and relatively unknown on the international stage, Traoré entered office, promising bold reforms, with a focus on restoring sovereignty and rebuilding critical infrastructure. Among his earliest priorities was energy. Traoré saw electricity not only as a basic necessity, but as the key to unlocking Burkina Faso's long-term potential. Without power, he argued, schools couldn't function. Hospitals couldn't operate, businesses couldn't grow, and digital innovation would remain out of reach. For him, electrification was more than a utility. It was the starting point of economic transformation and national pride. Instead of adopting small-scale incremental programs, Traoré proposed something few had imagined: a full-scale regional energy revolution. His plan called for the construction of 11 hydroelectric dams along the Mohoun River, one of Burkina Faso's major waterways, combined with a smart electric grid powered by artificial intelligence. The goal was to provide clean, reliable electricity to 15 West African nations, transforming the country into a regional power hub. The project's total cost was estimated at $800 billion, a figure that immediately drew global attention and, in many quarters, skepticism. Critics questioned whether such an ambitious initiative was feasible in a country with limited economic resources and ongoing security concerns. International observers noted that even some of the world's wealthiest nations had never attempted infrastructure projects of this magnitude. Traoré, however, remained unfazed. Rather than turn to traditional Western institutions for funding, which often come with conditions affecting sovereignty, he looked elsewhere. His administration pursued strategic partnerships with emerging economies, including Cuba, Iran, and Brazil. These nations, while not global superpowers, brought valuable technical expertise and a shared interest in South-South cooperation. Engineers and advisors from these countries joined local teams to conduct feasibility studies, terrain assessments, and resource mapping. Initial blueprints for the dam system and smart grid were drawn up. The project focused not only on energy production, but also on resilience, aiming to withstand droughts, flooding, and other regional climate challenges. Rather than outsource the entire process, the government prioritized training local workers, establishing technical programs to build a skilled labor force capable of maintaining the system in the long term. This emphasis on local capacity was seen as essential to achieving both economic independence and sustainability. At this early stage, many elements of the plan remained conceptual, but groundwork was being laid both physically and politically. Traoré's team launched nationwide information campaigns to explain the project's goals and secure public support. At regional summits, they presented the initiative as a potential model for collaborative development across the continent. The project marked a shift not just in scale, but in mindset. For decades, development in Africa had been shaped by outside agendas and incremental assistance. Traoré's vision proposed something different, a large-scale African-led solution designed from the ground up and implemented by those who lived with the consequences. As preparation advanced, construction began in several key locations. Teams broke ground for the first dam sites along the Mohoun River. Procurement of turbines, cables, and monitoring equipment commenced. The smart grid's digital architecture was drafted with input from software specialists in multiple countries. Momentum was building. What once sounded like a dream was beginning to take shape on the ground. And while doubts remained, the first steps of Africa's largest energy experiment were now underway. From the moment it was announced, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's $800 billion energy project attracted global attention, but not always the kind he had hoped for. In foreign policy circles and economic forums, skepticism ran deep. Many questioned whether a small landlocked country like Burkina Faso could realistically execute one of the most expensive and technically ambitious infrastructure projects in modern history. Some labeled the plan as unrealistic, calling it a pipe dream. Others worried it would become a burden too heavy for the country's modest economy to sustain. Few believed that the nation, with limited engineering capacity and ongoing security challenges, could deliver a smart energy grid spanning 15 countries. But on the ground, work was already underway. Construction crews broke ground on multiple dam sites along the Mohoun River, beginning the complex process of leveling rocky terrain, laying foundations, and pouring massive quantities of concrete. Each dam was designed to hold back millions of gallons of water, drive high-capacity turbines, and withstand the region's extreme weather patterns, including floods and droughts. The engineering behind the project was detailed and deliberate. The 11 dams were spaced strategically to maximize energy output while minimizing environmental disruption. Each installation included spillways and gates to manage water flow, and all were designed to function as part of a coordinated system. Water would flow from one dam to the next, generating electricity at every stage. In parallel, the framework for the smart power grid was taking shape. Thousands of miles of transmission cable were planned, and digital management systems powered by artificial intelligence were being programmed to allocate electricity efficiently across the region. The grid was built to adapt in real time. If one country's demand spiked, the system would automatically reroute supply to maintain stability. The logistical challenges were immense. Building massive infrastructure in remote areas meant transporting equipment across poor roads and difficult terrain. But rather than rely solely on foreign contractors, Traoré's administration invested heavily in training local workers. New vocational schools were opened to teach welding, electrical installation, turbine mechanics, and grid programming. By mid-project, over 1.5 million people were employed directly or indirectly through the initiative. The government placed strong emphasis on youth employment, targeting recent graduates and unemployed workers for job placement and technical training. For many, this was their first opportunity for long-term skilled employment. As workers installed turbines and laid foundations, something began to shift, not just physically, but socially. The project, once seen as impossible, was starting to yield tangible progress. Villages near construction zones reported increased economic activity. Cafes, tool shops, and housing cooperatives sprang up around the work sites. The energy project was no longer just a vision, it had become a living, breathing operation. International observers began to take notice. While some remained doubtful, others acknowledged the discipline and organization of the rollout. The involvement of foreign technical partners, particularly from Cuba, Iran, and Brazil, added credibility. These countries provided engineers, software developers, and logistical support, creating a global team anchored in Burkina Faso's leadership. The progress was not without obstacles. Supply chain delays, inflation, and intermittent security concerns slowed timelines. But the administration remained transparent about setbacks, releasing regular updates and adjusting plans where necessary. To many citizens, the greatest achievement was psychological. For the first time in decades, a major national project felt like it belonged to them. It wasn't a foreign development program. It was Burkinabe-led, Burkinabe-built, and ultimately, Burkinabe-owned. The first real test came quietly, without fanfare or global headlines. In a small village outside Dédougou in western Burkina Faso, a cluster of homes lit up one evening for the first time. The lights didn't flicker. They stayed on. Families gathered around electric bulbs instead of kerosene lamps. Children opened books after sunset. A local clinic powered its refrigeration unit and stored vaccines safely. For many, it was the first time they had experienced life with uninterrupted electricity. It was a small moment, but it carried enormous weight. This milestone marked the beginning of the operational phase of the Mohoun River hydropower initiative. After months of foundation work, construction, and wiring, the first segment of the smart electric grid had gone live. More villages soon followed, some in Mali, some in Niger, others in the northern corridors of Ghana. The system's AI-powered grid was working as planned. Electricity was being delivered efficiently, responding to real-time demand across distances. A surge in one region didn't knock out supply elsewhere. When usage dropped in a town overnight, the excess power was rerouted to irrigate farms or charge public infrastructure. Energy waste decreased. Reliability increased. For residents, the changes were immediate and practical. In rural communities, farmers began installing electric water pumps, enabling year-round irrigation. This allowed them to grow crops even in dry seasons, improving food security and income. In marketplaces, shopkeepers extended business hours using electric lights and digital payment systems. In schools, computers were turned on, and online learning became possible even in remote areas. Hospitals and clinics saw perhaps the most dramatic improvements. Medical equipment such as ventilators, autoclaves, and ultrasound machines, once idle due to lack of power, now operated without interruption. Maternal care units expanded services. Medicine refrigeration was stabilized. In one case, a regional hospital reported a 40% drop in neonatal deaths within 6 months of receiving consistent electricity. As word of progress spread, optimism grew. What began as a controversial mega-project was starting to reshape daily life. Families who once spent half their income on candles or batteries were now saving money. Young entrepreneurs started solar and repair businesses. Even public safety improved with new streetlights reducing nighttime crime in some areas. International attention followed. Development organizations began documenting the transformation, and independent energy watchdogs verified early success. Delegations from countries across Africa visited construction sites and operational hubs exploring how to replicate the model in their own regions. Private investors also began to respond. Over 40 green technology companies set up local offices around dam zones. These included startups working on battery storage energy analytics and decentralized solar grids. The influx of business created a secondary wave of job opportunities and knowledge transfer. To many observers, the most striking feature was not the technology, but the speed. In less than 2 years, parts of the country had gone from near total darkness to functional, reliable electrification. This, many noted, was rare. Even in larger economies with stronger institutional foundations, the success shifted how the public viewed the project and their own country. What had once been seen as an overreach was now viewed as a source of pride. In public squares, murals of dams and power lines appeared beside national flags. Traoré's name became synonymous not just with political change, but with competence. Burkina Faso, long dismissed as a passive recipient of aid, was now shaping a new image, that of a builder, a provider, and perhaps most importantly, a model. As more lights came on across Burkina Faso and its neighboring countries, the rest of the world began to pay attention. At first, the interest was academic. Think tanks, policy analysts, and international development agencies began tracking the data, looking to verify what local news and satellite images were already confirming. Something was changing in West Africa. Then came the political interest. Governments that had previously overlooked Burkina Faso now saw a potential partner, and in some cases a competitor. The successful rollout of the early phases of the 800 billion project raised questions not only about infrastructure, but about influence. Who would shape the next chapter of Africa's development? And on whose terms countries like China, India, and Russia moved quickly? Chinese state-owned companies offered to build research labs and storage systems to support the grid. Russia sent additional engineers to assist with dam optimization. India, facing growing energy demands of its own, explored the possibility of importing renewable energy from West Africa as part of a longer-term strategic plan. At the same time, Western powers, particularly those in Europe, recalibrated their stance. Once skeptical of the project's viability, they now expressed interest in participating. Several EU delegations visited Burkina Faso to explore possible cooperation on green energy trade, especially as the continent transitions away from fossil fuels. A proposed $20 billion extension of the grid under the Sahara Desert to North Africa and eventually into southern Europe suddenly looked less far-fetched. This shift in attention marked more than just new trade talks. It represented a change in how Burkina Faso was perceived on the global stage. The country was no longer framed as a development case. It was seen as a strategic actor, a place where policy decisions and investments could influence regional outcomes. The geopolitical implications became clearer. For decades, African infrastructure had been dominated by foreign-led development banks, Western aid agencies, and multinational corporations. Now, with a project funded through non-traditional partnerships led by local government and executed in large part by local workers, a different model was gaining traction. This approach, built around sovereign collaboration among emerging economies, challenged long-standing assumptions about dependency capacity and leadership in the global South. It also raised questions for global institutions. If Burkina Faso could launch and sustain such a project outside the traditional donor model, what would stop other nations from doing the same? Other African countries took notice too. Delegations from Sierra Leone, Togo, Niger, and Chad visited Burkina Faso to study the design of the grid and the administrative model behind it. Regional economic communities like ECOWAS began discussing the potential of replicating elements of the smart grid across borders. What was once a national initiative was fast becoming a regional movement. While the attention brought new opportunities, it also introduced new challenges. International firms competed for influence. New investment proposals flooded in, some with generous terms, others with strategic conditions. The government created new oversight bodies to vet foreign offers, balancing ambition with caution. For Captain Traoré and his administration, managing this new level of global engagement became part of the project's second phase. Energy was no longer just an internal challenge. It was now a currency of geopolitical leverage. In the process, Burkina Faso redefined its role in the international system, not as a passive recipient of policy, but as an architect of a new development paradigm, one that emphasized ownership, sustainability, and cooperation between equals. As construction on the remaining dams continues and new sections of the smart grid come online, Burkina Faso stands on the threshold of a new chapter and that could redefine not just its own trajectory, but that of West Africa as a whole. Already, the impact of the $800 billion project extends well beyond electricity. It is catalyzing transformation across key sectors: health, education, agriculture, and industry. Farmers now irrigate fields year-round, increasing yields and food security. Schools have access to computers and stable internet. Clinics can run diagnostics and refrigeration without interruption. Over 1 million jobs have been created so far, and that number continues to grow. From turbine technicians to AI software specialists, a new generation of skilled professionals is emerging, many of whom once had few prospects for formal employment. Vocational training centers are being converted into permanent technical institutes. Some analysts have described this as the beginning of a new industrial base for the region. The area surrounding the Mohoun River, once known mainly for its dry climate and limited development, is being dubbed the energy belt of Africa. Several international clean energy firms have set up research and manufacturing facilities nearby, working on next-generation solar panels, wind turbine designs, and battery storage systems. The influx of technology is turning parts of Burkina Faso into a laboratory for innovation. Looking ahead, officials estimate that by 2030, the full grid will serve up to 300 million people across 15 countries, covering both landlocked nations and coastal economies. Once dependent on fossil fuel imports and inconsistent grid systems, West Africa could become a net exporter of clean energy, with potential to supply even European markets through intercontinental grid extensions. But for many citizens, the most lasting impact of the project is psychological. Burkina Faso, once framed internationally as a country in need, is now widely recognized as a country with answers. The success of the project has reshaped national identity, especially among youth, instilling a sense of pride and ownership over the country's direction. In classrooms and cafes, conversations about engineering, data science, and public planning are becoming part of everyday life. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's leadership remains a central factor. Though still a polarizing figure in some circles, he is now credited not just with political change, but with executing the largest infrastructure transformation in Burkina Faso's history. Analysts say his decision to focus on self-reliance, non-traditional partnerships, and local labor has rewritten the narrative of African development. The legacy of the project is already inspiring imitators. Countries like Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone are exploring similar regional initiatives, focusing on shared water basins and cross-border infrastructure planning. A coalition of African energy ministers has formed to study how coordinated smart grids might serve as a backbone for continental growth. The ripple effects of Traoré's plan are still unfolding. But one thing is clear: this is no longer just a national project. It is becoming a continental model. A new approach to development led by Africans, built by Africans, and designed with African priorities in mind. In a region long defined by volatility and aid dependency, Burkina Faso is now defining itself, and potentially a new standard for what's possible.